The ranger's boot came down on Specialist Dara Witten's rifle before she could reach it. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, looked through her, the way men who have been in too many firefights learn to do. Like they're calculating whether you're worth the oxygen you're using. Then he walked away, and Witten was left kneeling in the dirt of a forward operating base in Kunar Province, Afghanistan. Her hands empty, the rifle 6 inches from her fingers. That was day one. She had not come to Afghanistan to be underestimated. She had not come to be anything, exactly. She had enlisted at 22 after 3 years of graduate-level mathematics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a partial scholarship, and a creeping sense that she was spending her entire life inside her own head. The Army had seemed like the antidote to that. It was not, but it had given her something else. A talent so precise and so specific that the institution didn't quite know what to do with it. Sergeant First Class Dale Pruitt, her unit's senior NCO, a compact man from rural Kentucky, who had the habit of rubbing the back of his neck when he was thinking, had noticed it during the qualification range at Fort Benning. Witten had fired a 40-round string at 300 meters. Every round had gone through the same hole in the paper. Not the same group, the same hole. Pruitt had pulled the target down himself, held it up to the Georgia sun. Then he'd walked over to where Witten was clearing her weapon and stood there for a long moment. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "I didn't," she said. "I worked it out." He had stared at her the way people stare at something they can't classify. She was used to it. She'd been getting that look since she was 9 years old and had corrected her 4th grade teacher's arithmetic in front of the whole class. Not to be difficult, just because the error was there, and errors had always bothered her the way a crooked picture frame bothers other people. Not urgently, not dramatically, just persistently until she did something about it. What she had worked out over months of obsessive reading and self-directed study was the mathematics of long-range precision fire. Ballistic coefficient, muzzle velocity, atmospheric density at altitude, the spin drift of a right-hand twist barrel, the Coriolis effect on projectiles at extended range. She had built her own formulas from first principles, cross-referenced them against published data, and then gone to the range and confirmed them, round by round, until the math and the rifle agreed with each other perfectly. She understood the physics of what a bullet did between the moment it left the muzzle and the moment it arrived at the target, the way a pianist understands chord structure, not as rules to follow, but as a language she had learned to think in. The Army, being the Army, had assigned her to a logistics battalion. She moved fuel and ammunition across the Kunar River Valley. She filled out requisition forms. She drove a 7-ton truck through switchback mountain roads that dropped 2,000 feet into nothing on one side, and she did it competently because Dara Witten did everything competently, and she did not complain because complaining about the Army's decisions was like complaining about weather. It was real, it was often unpleasant, and it changed nothing. But she kept shooting. On every FOB she was stationed at, she found the range. She practiced in the early mornings and late evenings when the range was empty. She carried a handwritten notebook with atmospheric data for every elevation she'd been posted at. She tracked wind patterns by watching the dust and the way the camp's few scraggly trees moved. She knew the temperature drop-off rates for the mountains in November versus March. She knew what happened to a .3008 round at 800 meters when the humidity dropped below 30%. She knew things that the men who laughed at her did not know she knew. The ranger whose boot had come down on her rifle was Captain Nolan Hark, Bravo Company, 1st Ranger Battalion, temporarily attached to the FOB for a joint operation that the officers called Ridgeline and the enlisted called, with the Army's gift for brutal brevity, the mess. She would learn all of this later. At the time, she only knew his rank by the patch on his shoulder and his contempt by the look in his eyes. She picked up the rifle. She carried it back to the armory. She said nothing. 2 weeks later, Captain Hark came to find her. He didn't come alone. He brought a ranger sergeant named Vic Coelho, who was the kind of man who took up more physical space than his actual body seemed to warrant, and a warrant officer named Bryn Sadler, who carried a battered green notebook and looked like she hadn't slept in 4 days, which was accurate. Sadler was the unit's intelligence officer. She was the one who spoke. Specialist Witten, she said. We need to talk to you about a conversation Sergeant Pruitt had with Colonel Ashfeld last week. Witten said nothing and waited. He told the colonel something about your range scores, Sadler said. We've been looking into it. Looking into what? Exactly. Everything, Sadler said, and for the first time since the conversation started, she smiled, just slightly. Can you come with us? What Sadler laid out in the TOC. A sandbag-reinforced room smelling of coffee and generator exhaust. Was a problem that had, in the 3 days since it became a problem, eaten most of the unit's planning capacity. A high-value target, a senior Taliban logistics coordinator known as Amir Safi, had established what appeared to be a temporary command node in a compound 8 kilometers north of the FOB, tucked into a cleft of rock at an elevation of nearly 7,000 feet. The compound was not the problem. The compound could be assaulted. The problem was the valley between them and the compound, which was 800 meters of open ground with virtually no cover, commanded by elevated positions on both sides that Safi's people had held for years and knew like their own heartbeats. The unit's assigned sniper, a staff sergeant named Caldwell, who was by all accounts genuinely gifted, was in a hospital in Bagram with a shattered fibula sustained during a previous operation. There was no replacement. There was no one else. We need someone who can hold overwatch at 1,200 meters, Sadler said. Covering the primary approach, 2 positions, alternating, so they can't fix your location. She put a satellite image on the table. She pointed to a rock formation at the ridgeline's western edge. From here, she said, you have line of sight on the main compound gate, the secondary approach corridor, and a 200-meter stretch of the valley floor. That's the likely extraction route if Safi tries to run. Witten looked at the image for a long time. 1,200 meters, she said. Yes, at this elevations, 6,800 feet. Witten pulled the image closer. She looked at the ridgeline. She looked at the angles. The wind comes off the secondary peak in the afternoon, she said, almost to herself. You'll want to move in the morning window, before the thermals shift. Hark, who had been standing against the wall with his arms crossed, straightened slightly. How do you know about the thermals? He said. Witten looked at him. I've been watching the dust patterns from the motor pool for 2 weeks, she said. The wind sheer off that ridge comes from the northeast at approximately 11 knots between 06 and 0900. After that, it's unpredictable. You'd be working with a 3 to 5 knot variable crosswind and no reliable baseline. There was a silence. What's the density altitude at 6,800 feet in November? Coelho said. It sounded like a test. At roughly 0 degrees Celsius, barometric pressure around 24.5 inches, density altitude is approximately 8,300 feet, Witten said. That affects bullet drops significantly at extended range. You're also dealing with spin drift. A right twist barrel at 1,200 meters will push the round approximately 6 to 8 inches right. More if the barrel's been running hot. You need to account for that before the first shot, not after. No one said anything. Hark looked at Sadler. Sadler looked at Witten. Can you take the shot if it comes to that? Sadler asked. Not can you make it, can you take it? The distinction mattered, and the fact that she made it told Witten something about Sadler. Dara looked at the satellite image one more time. She looked at the rock formation. She thought about the angles and the wind and the math she had been accumulating for 3 years in handwritten notebooks in the margins of her own off-duty hours. Yes, she said, the operation went wrong in the way that operations in Kunar province went wrong, which was specifically and fast. The assault element moved out at 0430, 90 minutes before first light, picking their way through terrain that the maps described as traversable and the actual ground described as a serious difference of opinion. Witten had moved out 40 minutes earlier with Coelho as her spotter. They reached the overwatch position at 0512, while it was still dark enough that the rocks were shapes rather than objects, and settled in. What Witten felt, lying prone behind a spotting scope at 6,800 feet with the cold, working its way through her uniform like water through sand, was not fear. It was something more specific than fear, and she had learned to call it by its accurate name, readiness, the state in which every variable she could control had been controlled, and the only thing remaining was to wait for the variables she couldn't control to declare themselves. She had her notebook open beside her. Wind, temperature, humidity reading from the small gauge she carried on her kit. She had zeroed the rifle, a borrowed M110 that she had spent 3 hours with the night before, learning its specific eccentricities at 300 meters and then done the mathematical correction for 1200. She had verified the correction 3 times using 2 different methods until both methods agreed. She was ready. She waited. Coelho was a good spotter, as it turned out. He didn't talk too much. He called out range corrections in a flat, unhurried voice and let the silences be silent. They had worked out a communication protocol in 40 minutes the night before that would have taken most partnerships several days to develop. He was also, she noticed, watching her as much as he was watching the compound, not suspiciously, assessing, updating. At 062T1, the assault element reached the compound perimeter. At 062T3, everything went wrong. The intelligence had been incomplete in the way that intelligence is always incomplete, which is to say it was accurate about what it knew and silent about what it didn't know. What it didn't know was that Safi had moved a secondary element, 8 fighters, into a position on the opposite ridgeline 12 hours earlier. Not the primary approach ridge, the secondary one, the one that covered the assault team's left flank. The first shots came from the east at 0623, and in the next 90 seconds, the situation restructured itself entirely. Witten heard it before she saw it. The flat crack of AK fire, multiple sources, and then the return fire of the assault element, and then Coelho's voice, very controlled, saying, "Contact east." Assault element under fire. Second story of the compound, 1 shooter, and he paused. Bravo 1 is down. Bravo 1 was the assault team's lead element. She didn't know who specifically was down. She found out later it was a ranger named Tomas, a man she had never spoken to, who would survive but would spend 4 months in physical therapy learning to walk again. What she knew at 0624 was that the assault element was pinned from 2 directions, that the compound shooter in the second story had a field of fire covering the primary rally point, and that if the element couldn't extract in the next 4 minutes, the tactical situation would collapse from bad to unrecoverable. Compound, second story center window, Coelho said. 1100 meters. Wind? Witten was already reading the indicators. The grass at the base of the compound wall, the dust, the way it moved, how fast, in what direction. 8 knots, 270 coming left, she said. Holding, not gusting. Range confirmed 1130. 11, not 1200. She adjusted. The calculation was not simple. At 1130 meters, with an 8-knot crosswind from the left, she needed to hold approximately 22 inches of wind correction. The spin drift at that range was 6 inches right, partially offsetting the wind push. Density altitude was adding approximately 15% to her effective drop, which meant her hold for elevation was 3 inches lower than her zero chart said, not higher. The window was 40 inches wide. The target was a man-shaped shadow behind it. She breathed out slowly. "Ready," she said. "Send it when ready." She waited. The shadow in the window moved, settled, stopped. She pressed the trigger. The suppressor reduced the report to something that sounded, at that range, like a heavy book dropped on a tile floor. In the scope, the window was empty. "Target down," Coelho said. His voice was the same flat, unhurried tone. He might have been confirming a vehicle inspection. "Good hit." The assault element, with the compound shooter neutralized, was able to extract. Safi was not in the compound. The intelligence had been wrong about that too, but 3 of his lieutenants were, and the documents recovered from the compound proved, in the weeks that followed, to be more valuable than the target himself would have been. The 2 rangers who had gone down in the contact were both alive. The element made it back to the FOB by 0900. There is a thing that happens after, and no one who hasn't experienced it describes it accurately. The movies get it wrong. They show relief, or satisfaction, or the hard-jawed composure of someone who has processed the moment and moved past it cleanly. What actually happens is more complicated and less linear than that. Witten sat in the TOC after the debrief, her notebook still open, and she looked at the numbers she had written in the margins during the operation. Wind, correction, hold, the scratch of a pencil on paper at 6,800 feet in the dark while a man stood in a window, and people she had never spoken to ran across open ground below. The numbers were correct. She had known they would be. The rifle had done what the math said it would do, and the man had not done anything after that, and the people below had gotten out. She sat with the weight of it. Pruitt came and sat beside her. He didn't say anything for a while. He poured coffee from a thermos into a styrofoam cup and set it in front of her without asking if she wanted it. "You know what you did today," he said finally. Not a question. "Yes," she said. "All of it." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "It doesn't get lighter," he said. "I can tell you it gets clearer, and that's the truth. You'll know exactly what it was, and you'll know exactly why, and that's actually important. That matters." He paused. "But lighter isn't the word." She looked at the coffee. She picked it up. 7 people came back today," Pruitt said. 2 of them were in that rally point when the compound went quiet. They had maybe 90 seconds before the situation. He stopped, looked at the wall. 7 people came back. "I know," Witten said. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel better." "I know," she said again. And she did know. He wasn't. He was telling her because it was true, and truth was the only currency that had value at this particular exchange rate, and Pruitt was the kind of man who understood that. Hark came in at 0940. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Witten in the way people look at things they have been wrong about and are not yet sure how to reclassify. Then he walked across the room and stopped in front of her. She looked up at him. "I owe you an apology," he said. "On the range. Day 1. Witten considered this. "Yes," she said. "I was wrong about what I saw." "You weren't wrong," she said. "You didn't see enough." She paused. "That's different." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Hark didn't seem like a man who smiled easily, but the functional equivalent of one. "Specialist Witten," he said. "For the record, I don't usually apologize." "For the record," she said, "I don't usually have to accept them." 3 months later, Witten was reassigned. The orders had come through channels she didn't fully understand, routed through an office at the Special Operations Command level that she had not known existed and was not authorized to ask questions about. They sent her to Fort Bragg for a 6-week evaluation and training program that was never given a formal name in any document she was handed, and at the end of which she was offered a position she had not applied for and had not known to want. She took it. The notebook went with her. She had started a new one by then, the 4th in the series, its predecessors filled with data from Kunar Province, from the ranges at Benning, from the cold early mornings on every phobby she'd been stationed at when she got there before anyone else and stayed after everyone left. She dated the entries. She recorded atmospheric conditions, range data, correction calculations, wind patterns that repeated, patterns that didn't. She understood now, building a library of variables, of corrections, of the infinite specific ways that distance and atmosphere and physics interact with the basic fact of a small piece of metal moving very fast through space. She had been building it since she was a graduate student, making too little money and asking too many questions, and she was not done building it. She suspected she never would be. That was not a problem. It was the point. There is a particular kind of readiness that is not about confidence. It isn't the certainty that things will go right. It's something quieter than that, a familiarity with all the ways things can go wrong, and a practiced calm about your own position within that uncertainty. Dara Witten had that kind of readiness. She had worked for it the way she had worked for everything, systematically, methodically, in the margins of time that other people spent sleeping. Pruitt had been right. The weight of what had happened in Kunar Province did not get lighter, but it got clearer as he'd promised. She knew what it was. She knew why. She carried it with the same precision she brought to everything else, not minimizing it, not dramatizing it, just holding it at its accurate size. On the flight to Fort Bragg, she opened the new notebook to the first empty page. She wrote the date. She wrote the elevation of Fayetteville, North Carolina, 102 feet above sea level. She wrote the estimated humidity from memory, then flagged it with a question mark because she didn't have a confirmed reading yet. She would get one when she landed. She always got the number before she needed it. That was the whole point. To have the answer ready before the question was asked, to have done the work before the moment arrived, so that when the moment came, all that was left was the still, centered act of doing what you already knew how to do. She clicked the pen closed. She looked out the window at the brown farmland 30,000 feet below, the winter fields of the Middle South, the straight lines of county roads and irrigation channels, and property boundaries that looked, from altitude, like a diagram of someone's careful intention, like a proof. Outside the window, the sky was flat and enormous and exact. She closed the notebook. She was ready.